We'll get rolling in just a minute. All right, we're ready to go. And so I want to begin by welcoming all of you to this webinar, which is sponsored by the Max de Pree Center for Leadership at Fuller Seminary. My name is Mark Roberts, and I'm a senior strategist for the de Pree Center. I focus on the spiritual formation of marketplace leaders and on the flourishing of leaders in the third of life. I should say that here at the de Pree Center, we imagine a world in which Christian leaders across industries and seasons of life are deeply formed as disciples of Jesus, as they wisely seek the very best for the people and the systems entrusted to their care. We believe human flourishing is as much about seeking the flourishing of our neighbor as it is about seeking our own flourishing. And we believe that no one gets where they want to go alone. The de Pree Center has produced many resources to help leaders respond faithfully to God's callings in all seasons of life for the sake of God's redemptive work in the world. And among those tools are a bunch of webinars we have done in which we interview leaders of note, folk who have wisdom about diverse facets of work and life and leadership. Today, I'm excited to host a webinar with one of these outstanding leaders, Dr. Uli Chi. Let me say just a word about the game plan here. After I introduce Uli, he and I are going to have a conversation for about 30 minutes. And then he will respond to questions from you. If you at any point have a question, please put it in the Q&A function of Zoom, not in the chat, but the Q&A function. And that way we can pass it on to Uli. I should also mention that this webinar is being recorded and will be available via the de Pree Center website and on YouTube, so you can share it easily with your friends and your associates. There's also in the chat of a Zoom, you will find a bunch of links to things like Uli's book and some of the resources at the de Pree Center. So I encourage you to check out the chat. Now, our guest for today's webinar is Dr. Uli Chi. Uli has been a leader in business, theological education, healthcare governance, and the local church. As an award-winning technological entrepreneur, he founded a software company that developed 3D virtual reality software, revolutionizing decision-making for consumers and businesses. Since retiring from that business, he served in a wide array of institutions, including, I might add, the advisory board of the de Pree Center, where he has served for 2 decades. And we at the de Pree Center are deeply grateful for Uli's wisdom, his commitment, support, and mentorship. Now, as an author, Uli has written over 100 devotions for the de Pree Center's Life for Leaders. Earlier last month, he published his first book, The Wise Leader. In the foreword to that book, Mark Laberton, President Emeritus of Fuller Seminary, says this: if you're seeking wisdom, don't rush reading this book. Savor it, reread each chapter 2 or 3 times, share this experience with others on the road of life with you at work, at home, at school, church, or wherever. So today we want to focus especially on the share this experience part of wisdom as we explore the topic, nurturing intergenerational wisdom. And so with no further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Uli Chi to this webinar. Uli, thanks so much for being with us today.
Well, Mark, thank you so much. And that seems like a lot of ado, not just a little and no further, but so grateful to be with you, Mark. I've come to so appreciate not only the de Pree Center, but you and the friendship we've developed over the last decade or so. And I just want to acknowledge that, I know we're going to talk about my book a little bit, but I just want to acknowledge your role in helping that to happen at all in this season of my life. I you were one of the first. I really hadn't written much of anything for publication. I've written stuff, as part of business, but nothing for publication. And I started doing a little bit of writing when I, quote, retired or entered the third of my life. And you were one of the very first to take notice of it and to encourage it. And so thank you for your part in that. And it's significantly shaped this season of life for me. And also, I just want to say I'm so much appreciative of the third work, not only that you're doing, but that the Pree Center is doing, because this is such an important season of life that for many of us, we don't think much about this part of life. It seems like this is the part of life that comes after our professional life. And actually, there's much more to it, obviously, as you know very well.
Well, thanks, Uli. And as you know, we're going to talk about nurturing intergenerational wisdom. But I thought at first it would be interesting. You've mentioned the book, and I have. Let us know a little bit about the book, The Wise Leader, and maybe what why you wrote the book, and maybe the main thing you're trying to communicate in it.
Sure.
Why did you write this book?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I did a Google search on Amazon, and there are like 50,000 books on leadership, right? So why would anyone write one more book? And why on wisdom in particular? Well, I think I think the need for wisdom is I mean, just looking around us in the world today, it's a very challenging world that we live in, with lots of tensions and polarization and stuff. Other people have commented on that much more wisely than I have, but I think the need for wisdom couldn't be greater, I think, than in our generation. So I think that's probably the main reason. And you might wonder, people might wonder about the audience, my intended audience for the book. And that's one of the questions that my publisher asked me when I was about doing this. And I think I sort of have two main audiences in mind. One is perhaps the obvious one, folks who are in leadership currently, either who are, currently in the middle of their careers or at the height of their powers in leadership, and also those who are at the beginning of their leadership journey. But I think that's one obvious audience. The other is actually people like me, people who've, quote, retired, unquote, who are in this season of life, who are thinking a lot more about our legacy and, what have we learned? What can we pass on that's useful to another generation? And just again, speaking more personally, I find that I've spent most of my life, working, quote, leading or serving others. And I think the reality is most of my life has been doing rather than reflecting. I think of myself as a reasonably reflective person and as a leader when I was active in my business. But at the same time, it's just busy, right? Life is so full, and running a business or running whatever leadership role the person has, it's just there's very little time really to step back and reflect. And I think I've so appreciated this season of my life where I have had a chance to really reflect on what I've learned in terms of and what is worth passing on. And that's really what this is about.
You talk about this season of life, and in which you and I are both in. We call the third at the Pree Center. We often associate wisdom with older adults, and there's a good reason for that. And many of us would have stories of older people whose wisdom has really influenced our life. I'm wondering if in a different season of your life, when you were younger, if you had some of those people, some who were older, who really shared their wisdom with you and helped you to grow in wisdom.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the list is really quite long, but I would pick probably two people in particular, maybe one from the business context and one from my church context. I got to know a friend who was the father of a close friend of ours, who was a retired executive from Stanford Research Institute, and he had sort of specialized on entrepreneurial work and business development. And he sort of took me under his wing, and he invited me. He lived in Palo Alto. I was living in Seattle, as I do now. And he just said, "Hey, why don't you come down? I know you're interested. You've thought about maybe starting a business. Let's just talk about that." And so literally, he was in his, I would guess, 60, probably my age. Seemed like he was quite old at the time, but doesn't seem quite so old anymore. But we spent usually a day or two. And we did this several times, and we talked about the whys and the hows of starting a business. And it was just so invaluable to
Mm,
have someone invest themselves in me. And he didn't have any particular agenda. He was really sort of focused on me as a person and focused on my interests. And it was just incredibly helpful. I mean, I'm very sure that my business, in terms of my own formation as a leader in business, would have been quite different without them. So that was one very significant thing. I was probably in my, I don't remember now, probably in my 30s early 30s at the time. Another was from a church context in terms of someone who sort of helped pass on wisdom to me was my senior pastor.
mm,
I tell in the book that I didn't grow up in a Christian home, so I came to Christ in my late teenage years, joined a local Presbyterian church, and so I knew nothing about anything actually. I thought I used to think that Christ was Jesus's last name or something, right? So it was
mhm,
one of those things where I came in pretty much a blank slate. Anyway, so for whatever reason, he sort of took an interest in me and took me under his wing, and we spent time. He invited me at one point to join. He had a prayer meeting with a couple of his elders on Saturday night, praying for Sunday morning, and he just said, "Would you like to come and pray?" And I said, "Sure." And we spent about I don't know hour or two together, and half the time they the elders sort of talked about what was going on in the church, what was important, and then we spent half our time on our knees praying for the church, for Sunday, and for the community, the congregation. And it really, I mean, just the chance to see and watch and enter into with them their experience of what it meant to lead and to serve and to love a community, I think really shaped me as a person who, and obviously it shaped me in terms of loving and caring about the local congregation, but it also shaped the way I thought about how to lead people in terms of
mm.
at the core of leadership was caring about the person rather than just the task of leadership. So
Wow.
those are a couple examples.
Well, and Uli, your examples really illustrate what you've just said, in that it's not just about the passing on of wise content, but it's much more of a relational kind of thing. And I've read your book, so I know I'm stealing your ideas right now. So yeah, but do you want to
They're
you want
not
to
my
talk?
ideas, Mark.
Well, that's true. A few others, like the Lord, thought of them first. But uh, talk more about the importance of relationship
Mm.
in leadership and in this sharing of wisdom and growing in wisdom.
Yeah. Oh, I think that's, you could argue probably one of the central theses or themes of my book is that wisdom is about relationships, not about a transaction. You can, I mean, just in terms of how I'm wired, I think, and my life and business, you tend to focus a lot on transactions of various kinds and even very good ones. That doesn't mean transactions are necessarily a negative term at all. I think there are transactions that happen, right, that are part of life. But I think to think of wisdom as sort of passing on knowledge to someone else, I think is at best a very limited understanding of what wisdom is about. Because I think fundamentally, a biblical understanding of wisdom is that wisdom is about a person and about relationships. Jesus said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life," not "I have the way, the truth, and the life." In his person, he embodied, and we, as those who are made in the image of God, are of such significance that it's really about our relationships and how we live that out, and particularly those of us as leaders, that's at the core of what it means to be wise. So, and I think that in terms of thinking about passing on in terms of our conversation today, particularly in an intergenerational context, I think it's really important not to see passing on wisdom as a project,
Mm,
to see the person as a project or a
mm,
transaction, but that to really genuinely get to know and care about the individual. I think the two people I mentioned, my pastor and my business friend, who was one of my key mentors, I mean, I can clearly tell, looking back, certainly, that that's how they saw me. It wasn't like I was a project
mm.
that they had to somehow help me get something done as opposed to really investing in me. So I think developing a genuine relationship, I think, is really critical. And I think the other third thing, so more generally, is it that's one of the challenges, I think, of intergenerational wisdom transfer, if we can use that language. It's that it requires time and space and investment. It isn't something that's easy to turn into a quick set of tasks to get things done. And I know I'm a task-oriented person. I lived in a business world that is measured on results, and results sometimes in developing wisdom and passing on wisdom to others is fundamentally about the relationship. And I think it's very much harder than simply passing on a set of ideas or even a set of skills or capabilities to someone else.
Yeah, it's so striking to me as you emphasize the importance of relationship in all of this, and certainly on the theological basis. I mean, God could have just sent us more stone tablets, right, with more guidance, but what God did is come and lived among us, and then created through the Spirit a community of people who share life together, and wisdom it flourishes in that context. It seems like one of the challenges many of us face today is that we're rather more separated generationally than perhaps we once were in other contexts of life. If people were living in a village, or even in major urban areas like New York, there'd be the neighborhoods, and there'd be a lot of intergenerational activity. For many of us, that isn't happening as much today. I wonder if you have some thoughts about that, and what. So if I'm sitting here thinking, I'd love to be able to be in the kind of relationship you talk about, but I'm not quite sure what to do. Have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think just to begin with, maybe in part because I'm a technologist, technology, is a dual-edged sword, and in some ways it can be a problem, and we've a lot of conversation around issues surrounding technology, but there's a wonderful gift to technology too. I mean, think about what we're doing right here, right? I mean, this would not have been possible without the video conferencing technology that's developed. And I think from a relationship building point of view, technology can be helpful. I stay in touch with lots of folks, younger generations of folks, where it's not possible for us to meet regularly in person, certainly. And so being able just to use the technology to reach out and to connect and to cultivate, I think those are, I'm a grandparent, and I have a son and daughter-in-law who live 1,000 miles away, and they have 2 children. And so FaceTime, and whatever, it's a way to stay connected. And I think if you start with my premise that wisdom is fundamentally about relationships, it's really finding ways to connect. And that's true with, FaceTime or Zoom or messaging and group messaging. I know you've told me the story of in your family, doing group messages with your kids. And that's a wonderful way just to stay connected. I have another friend who plays Wordle with his adult children every day. Because it just is a way to stay connected, and I know that sounds trite at one level, but I think we underestimate the importance of developing ways to connect with folks. I know for me, I find that again, this goes back to my comment that not to turn the person that you want to perhaps share wisdom with into a project is, I think you start really by caring for them, and making sure that you have a chance to get to know them as persons. And I find that's one of the harder things. I mean, I have lots of ideas. I have, as you can tell, writing a book, I guess, but I have lots of ideas about what I want to share with other people. And I think what I've learned in terms, particularly not just with younger generation, but just even my own generation, is one of the hardest things to do is really trying to understand other people's worlds that's inside their heads, and to get to know what really matters to them. Because I think I know what should matter to them, or perhaps I think matters to them, but actually listening carefully and asking lots of questions. Max Dupree, who's one of our,
Mhm.
Max's name is on the center that you're a part of and that I'm associated with. But I think as I've watched, and Max is a generation ahead of me, but he was so brilliant at asking questions. I mean, I've spent some time with him, and if I can use the word, I was in awe of his ability to ask great questions. And
Mhm.
sometimes, I find I ask questions to make a point. I don't know if you've had
Mhm.
that experience with
Sure.
people have that
No,
experience.
I never do that. I
You
never
never
do.
do that, right? You never do that. I try not to do that, but I'm sure I do it more than I realize. But Max's question invariably reflected a genuine desire to understand
Yeah.
the other. And that's really in our age and time when, we sort of have put labels on everybody. We sort of know where they fit right, left, or theologically or whatever, or just whatever categories we put people in. It's just really important, I think, in wisdom, particularly in a conflicted time, to recognize we're dealing with people who are made in the image of God, and no label is enough.
Yeah.
And that whatever label we want to put on them, they're more than that label. And I think the challenge is to begin to try to understand them as persons made in the image of God, so that and be able to have a conversation about wisdom,
Huh.
perhaps around that. So,
That's, I love what you're saying about question asking. I'm reminded of a time I had when I worked in Texas for a while for a family foundation and had that's associated with the HEB grocery company. If there are any Texans on this, they'll know this. It's the largest grocery company in Texas and one of the largest privately held companies in America, and one that is exceptionally well led. When Glassdoor comes out with the most sort of beloved CEOs in America, the CEO at that time and chairman of the board, Charles Butt, was always on that list. And one night I was able to have dinner with him at a party with just four of us sitting around the table. And I expected that he would be one of those people who just filled the space with his ideas, because often big leader types do that, right? And what he did is what you're describing. And it was so interesting because it wasn't just superficial. Like, he'd ask the one question and then a deeper question. And you realize, oh, he just really, really wants to know us.
yeah,
And it wasn't a business thing, but it was but I came away from that so struck by the very thing you're saying, that his curiosity and
yes.
care for people was communicated through question asking, which, it really leads to one of the things I want to ask you. I mean, we're calling this webinar Nurturing Intergenerational Wisdom. And obviously there is, we often think of those of us who are older passing on wisdom to those who are younger. But I know we also think about it the other way, that sometimes we gain wisdom from those who are younger than we are. I'm just curious if you can think of a time in your life when that happened, when you actually learned something and gained some wisdom from someone who was younger than you.
Oh, well, not just one time, all the time, right? I mean,
Huh.
I think I just so value. I mean, just take somebody from the Pree Center, Michaela O'Donnell, who's your successor and is currently executive director there. Every time I'm with Michaela, I learn something. I mean, I think,
Mm-hmm.
and she's, almost half my age. And
Mm-hmm.
um, so I think the reality is that as those of us who are older, I think one of the challenges is to remain, like you say, curious, humble in the sense of viewing ourselves not as so much as something to pass something on to folks, but that we're in this posture of learning and growing ourselves. And I think it goes back. In my book, I talk about not only is wisdom relational, but it's mutual. That is, there's a communal dimension to wisdom, which means that everybody has something to offer. I'm so struck by Paul's language in Corinthians about that even the weak we value the weakest parts
Mm-hmm.
more, right? And because they're important. And I find that I think we tend to have I tend to have my own sort of mental picture of what who has something to offer. And I think one of the things I've learned, I think particularly those who are younger than we are, than you and I are at least, those I think they have a lot to offer, and there's a lot to be learned in terms of interacting with them. And so I actually personally I've made it a point to keep a list of um, younger generation folks that I know, and and in part to two things. One is to be in prayer for them. I think that's a wonderful way to sort of cultivate relationships with those who are younger than we are, just by praying for them, first of all. And secondly, to be intentional, to look for opportunities to interact. And so I spend a lot of time taking people out to coffee or lunch with no particular agenda. I mean, I'm not there to recruit them for anything or that trying to, fundraise to give some money. I mean, that happens in some settings, but many of these things, it's just, I'm just interested in how are you doing? How's your work going? Tell me about the things that, that are going on in your life. And I think that's not only good for them in the sense that I'm taking interest in them, but I'm learning something about their life and their world. And the truth is, as I've gotten older, it's easy to hang out with people like me.
Mm-hmm.
And so you see the world through a very distinct set of lenses. And I really value the chance to hear and to see and to experience the world for those who are younger. Now, I have grandchildren, so that's another way, to enter into. And I learn things from my grandkids, right? I mean, I just
Mm-hmm.
want to feel a
Mm-hmm.
sense of joy and delight and playfulness. And, I tend to think of wisdom sometimes as a very sort of serious thing. And there's the delight and joy, right? That is actually an aspect of wisdom. I don't know if
So,
that answers I'm not sure I've
oh
been
no,
a
it
response to
does.
the
It
question.
it does. And I'm struck by the fact that I've done a fair amount of reading on things like mentoring and all. And there are some who really strongly believe that a potential mentor should not pursue someone to mentor, but should wait until that person pursues him or her. Which, interestingly enough, was the way the the rabbis in the time of Jesus. That's how they got their students. The students that come to them. Jesus actually flipped it, and I guess I think both ways work, because what I've found, similar to what you've just described, is if there's a person that I just sense something about, like I want to follow up with them, uh, I'll often do just as you said. Say, how about if we get coffee sometime? And I don't really have an agenda. I just want to get to know you more, and we will begin. And some of those relationships have now continued for several years. They began in that kind of just informal and friendly way. So I think of that, and it's in those contexts. So one of those people is a younger man. He's half my age, really an amazing business person who, and when we talk, so I learn a lot about business from him, and he learns a lot about family and faith from me.
Mm.
And we have this sort of sweet interchange, and he's willing to explain to me things that he is doing in he's a developer, and how he approaches things. And so I'm learning from him,
Mm.
and then I get to share some things with him. But it is the question asking. It's sometimes it's as simple as, tell me more about that. What do
Yes.
you mean by that? And I think now, I do know that sometimes those of us who are older are kind of resistant to learning from those who are younger. We hesitate, or there's some barriers.
Mm.
Do you have any thoughts about that? Have you seen it, or you have some ideas about how not to get stuck there?
No, I don't have any magic. I wish I had some silver bullets for us and for me, myself
Yeah.
included. And this again will sound fairly, I hope it doesn't sound trite. I think it's simple but not easy. I think you just got to do it. I mean, I think you got to, and I think you start. I do think where you start matters. You don't. I find that sometimes when I have the urge to want to pass things on, that I too easily become focused on what it is that I'm interested in, and I think
Mm, mm,
much more helpful to start, like I said, we've said several times now, start with the person in the relationship, and I think you
mm,
start by just start praying for folks, and the people that who are, we all have relationships of some kind, It could be family, it could be church, it could be business, it could be nonprofits, whatever. And just start praying for folks. And I do that as part of my own spiritual disciplines. I have a list
Mm,
of people that I pray for by name because I just want to remember each day
mm,
that these people matter to me, right? And so that's the beginning for me. And then I think the second thing is being intentional about finding ways to spend time together, just looking for the opportunities, right?
mm,
And then the third thing, I think it is an attitude of the heart at one level that I think the hardest thing for me, that maybe the hardest switch for me in my life has been to view, whether you call it mentoring or passing on wisdom or whatever, as something that is my thing to do, as opposed to trying to view that as one that this is something that God is at work in us and in the relationship, and that we are really there to learn as much as to pass on anything that
mm,
we've learned. And
mm,
I think another aspect of that too is um, humility is a key aspect, I
mm,
think, of what people are looking for. There's a wonderful quote. I don't know if I don't have the book here with me, unfortunately, but there's a wonderful quote from T.S. Eliot where he says basically, you know, humility, let me not hear of the wisdom of old men. you know,
mm,
what people want to hear is not just, our success stories or what we've learned, that are positive, but being willing to be vulnerable with another generation and to
mm,
say this, didn't work for me. In his quote, he ends by saying, humility is endless.
mm,
I think people are looking for folks who will be genuine with them. Of course, there are things that we've learned that are positive, experiences that we can pass on without a doubt. But at the same time, I think people know that there's an aspect of our experience that if we're not being willing to be vulnerable with them, we're not really entering into the relationship. So
mm.
that's the price of admission in one sense.
Yeah. Well, you used a couple of really important words right there, both humility and vulnerability. And so that, again, you said it, these relationships, this isn't a project, or it's a genuine relationship. As you're talking about this, and by the way, I should say to folk who are here, if you have questions for Uli, you can put them in the Q&A. If you don't, that's okay. We'll keep going. But if you want to ask something, you can do that, and I'll pass it on to him. I mean, it strikes me, Uli, you mentioned being initially having a very important relationship with your pastor and being really new to Christ. And I know the church has been so important to you. I've had privilege of being worshiping with your church in the Seattle area. You're part of a wonderful church. You've served in a variety of roles, and I know how committed you are to the church. It seems like this conversation we're having about intergenerational wisdom, like the church would be a phenomenal place for this. And I expect maybe sometimes it happens, as in your case, but do you have thoughts about that? Things that the church, either we ought to stop doing this or we should do more of this, or here's a way we can encourage it, because I expect that a lot of folk who are listening to this are engaged in their church or church leaders. What could we do you think, those of us who are really leaders in the church, whether we're pastors or elders or whatever, what could we do to encourage this kind of intergenerational wisdom sharing?
Well, I think it's a great question, Mark. I think in my experience, I think there's been more of a focus on sort of affinity or stage of life groups where people meet with others who are, say, who are young parents or who are in a particular stage in their career. And I think that's a good thing. But I think it loses one of the things that is unfortunate that uh, gets lost is having a smaller group setting where there's an intergenerational dynamic in the part of the small group. I was part of fairly early in I was married at the time, and this was probably in my mid 30s. We started meeting with a small group that had older generations as well as those of us who were younger. I found that immensely helpful. I mean, I
Mm,
think it was a chance to hear experience, and there were things that they had been through we had a very young family. They had already adult children, and it was just a chance to see life through their lens, which is immensely helpful. So
Mm.
I think intergenerational small groups, I would think would be a helpful way to encourage this kind of, conversation and this kind of relationship building. And you can't do that with, just in a larger group, right? You need at some level have interactions. And I think the church can facilitate that by creating intergenerational groups as well as sort of stage of life groups. So that's one thought. Another thing that, again, uh, that we've done with some friends, I have a good friend of mine who's a veterinarian who's a bit older than I am, who retired. And he likes to cook, and I do too. And so we've hosted dinners deliberately for younger generations of either newer members or, just folks who are just visiting or whatever. And just, again, not with the idea of a particular agenda, but just as a get acquainted thing. And so and with this, we tried to do it without children, because most of these families had younger children. So give them a chance to sort of have a quiet evening with just adult conversation. And we would do the dinner for them, and we'd spend 2 or 3 hours together. And invariably part of that was, why are you here? Why are you at this church, and what brought you here? And we share our journey of what it's been like. And what I've noticed is how, and maybe this is a good thing for the church too, is that it helps people get connected and stay in the relationship in the church when there's so many pressures to sort of move on, right? And so I find that that's been a real helpful thing. A third thing, again, this I'm not suggesting this is the right thing for every church or something, but one of the things we did, this was now 20 years ago, we started a group of us who are golfers, started a men's golf outing, and we deliberately did it multi-generationally. We invited our kids, and it was just for guys, and I think a lot of the spouses of the guys who were there were delighted because they wanted a chance for the guys to meet other guys, right? So process life, and we went through a lot of things. I mean, there were lots of over the years, there were many folks who had been through some very difficult times where that was an opportunity for them to connect and find, wisdom and comfort. And so those are three examples, I guess.
Yeah, they're great examples. You stirred up memories in me. One was, you mentioned when you do these dinners, you tend not to want to have the younger children there, which could sound unfriendly. But I remember one time, just like an older couple, when I was pastoring the church in Irvine, an older couple invited us over and said, please bring your children for dinner. Bring your children. Our children were like 2 and 4. We got to their house, and I looked around in horror because they had lots and lots of low tables with really expensive items of art on them and crystal. And I'm thinking, oh no, this is not going to end well. And I just remember thinking they were trying to be very generous, and in fact, we had to spend the whole night, making sure our kids didn't destroy stuff. That's one story. The other story, although we weren't in a small group, there was a couple named Don and Xandra with a Z, in the church. And we just connected with them. And they were a good bit older than we were. They could have been our parents' age or about. And I mean, especially in the area of family and parenting, they had such wisdom. But it was wisdom in relationship. I mean, we really got to know them and shared time together. And to this day, we will still try to get together with them once a year because the relationship's there. So I think the potential is there, but I think you rightly identify the fact that sometimes the church is so layered in terms of generations. We've got to find some ways to work on that.
I was just going to say, I think, those are wonderful illustrations. Those are exactly very much like my own experience. And one of the reasons we weren't trying to, make the kids not feel welcome. But I think, the realities of being able to have a conversation like in a setting where there's a mixed group in terms
Right.
of very young children, it's really quite difficult to have conversations. So, and I think the reality too is that people who have young children value a chance to to have
Yeah.
just adult conversation, right? So, yeah.
One of the things we did do, this was a larger church ministry, but we would do like parents' night out. And what that was we actually had childcare at church, but no program for the adults. It's just you can come and we will, the church will take care of watching your children for, I think it was 3 hours. So you can have some time just out. And that was fun. Well, as we're getting near the wrapping up point of this conversation, I'm wondering if there are some things that you know, I haven't asked all the possible things, and there's so much more we could talk about, but a word of caution or a word of encouragement or something to folk who are really wanting to engage in this kind of intergenerational wisdom relationships, and what might you want to say to them?
Um, I guess I have three thoughts, but I think the overall thought is one, I'm just so grateful for you and for the Pree Center hosting this conversation, because I think
Mm,
this is such a great opportunity, and the need is great, and the opportunity is great, and simply doing it, I think, is and
mm,
being willing to be intentional about it is a great thing. I guess three things, just by way of summary. I think one is, as we've said multiple times, I think that the caution and maybe the not just the caution, but the emphasis, I think, needs to be on to focus on the person and the relationship, not just on the results or viewing it as a transactional thing. I think I have to admit my own, and as I've talked with others my age, people who are business people who have wisdom and lots of very wise folks, the problem with much of it, in my experience, is that it feels more like they're looking for a project or a transaction to pass on certain things to someone else. And I think that's sort of getting the cart before the horse. I think the horse is, it's about the relationship, it's about the person,
mm,
it's about learning how to interact in that way. The second thing I would say is, which is sort of a corollary, is that I think we need to be learners and not just teachers. In whatever stage we're in, I think wisdom is about learning as much as it is about teaching. It's about asking questions as much as about providing answers for people. And I think it's about humility, fundamentally, that humility is endless, to use T.S. Eliot's language. I think that's the core. Others who have read my book, particularly folks in our season of life, I had a friend of mine who just said to me, that seems to me the core message of your book. And I think that's not too far from being accurate. Wisdom is fundamentally about humility. Jesus himself, right, was ultimately the one who emptied himself and became human and died on the cross for our sakes. And that model of how you lead wisely is at the core of who we are as Christians, I think. And it's so easy to forget. And I think part of that is, as I said already earlier, is learning to share our failures as well as our successes, right?
mm,
To be vulnerable in that sense. I remember a
mm,
conversation, probably one of my last in-person conversations with Max before he passed. I was visiting him in Michigan, and I was frustrated at the time. This was over 10 years ago now. I was near the end of my tenure as my business, and I was trying to turn some things around, and I'd made progress in some areas and felt frustrated in others, and I had had the experience before of really sort of doing, so the big curve thing going up and growing the business. And it wasn't sort of playing out that way. And I remember saying to Max, what should I do? What wisdom do you have for me? And I was talking to him about all the particulars. And he stopped for a minute and was sort of silent. And then finally said quietly to me, maybe you ought to fail at something. Maybe you need to fail at something.
mm.
And I thought that was the last thing I wanted to hear. I sort of like, thanks, that's really helpful. But he was right. I mean, there was an aspect of, it's so easy in just the nature of our work and our way of thinking about things, or at least for me, to see success as being the sort of the ultimate test. And
Mm.
I think many things in our experience and our life as leaders that people learn from are actually that's true for us personally, right? I mean, you know this, Mark. I know this. I've learned some of the greatest things, lessons of my life through my failures, right?
Yeah.
So it shouldn't surprise us that we need to share that somehow with others.
Mm,
Be able to pass that on, right? So I think that's the second thing I would say. The third thing, we haven't talked about this at all.
mm,
It's the last chapter of my book is I think there's a dimension of leadership that is different than what we would expect it to be. Like I tend to have thought about wisdom as being mostly about becoming discerning and wise. Sort of the say, I talk about my grandfather in my book at the beginning. You know, he's Chinese. He wore the robe of a scholar, and he looked like a Jedi Knight, right? I mean, he's sort of like the ultimate Obi-Wan
yeah.
Kenobi kind of guy. And that's sort of my picture of wisdom. And actually, one of the things I've learned in writing the book and reflecting more is that there's two very surprisingly different dimensions of wisdom. One is the childlike dimension of wisdom, that there's a dimension of wisdom that's about learning trust and vulnerability, which is not the same thing as being wise and discerning in the way at least I thought about it, right? The willingness to trust God and to be open to being vulnerable, which means to be wounded by potentially by other people, right?
Mm,
That doesn't feel like being very wise to me,
mm,
sort of looking in from the outside. And I think that's not something that we just do once when we're young or when we're young in the faith, even. It's something we need to grow. And Jesus himself said, the greatest will be, right? Those who, you know, like being a child. So I think that's a childlike dimension is really important to develop. And then
mm,
second is we've talked a little bit about is the curiosity and playfulness dimension,
mm,
where and this is where the younger generations have something to teach those of us who are older,
mm,
because they're more naturally curious and playful. I
mm,
had a good friend of mine who you and I both know, I won't name him, but a very wise, seasoned, experienced, capable person about my age, about our age. And he said to me the other day, he said, I need to learn to play more,
mm.
right? Because I think as you get older, it's easy to become to view our role as being serious,
Right.
in our work. And I think we actually miss something. And then the wisest people I've known who were young, who when I was younger, looking up to those who were older, they had people I admired had a sort of playful quality to them. There's a playfulness to their wisdom, which I think we need to we need to not just recognize that, but we need to cultivate that in our life, being willing to be curious and to be playful. So those are the three things, probably more than.
That, that's so interesting. I actually have a great example of the playfulness and humility aspect. Some years ago, I had the most amazing opportunity to have a fairly intimate lunch with Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who
Mm,
is, I think many would say, one of the wisest men in the world. Also a man who has known tremendous suffering and
mm,
pain. And so I was, just fascinated. What it would be like to be with him? And for sure, he said and shared many things that were wise. But I think it's true that I have never been with any human being who laughed more than he did. And it was just so striking to me that here's someone who, you know, could be weighed down by the horrible cares of the world and someone very aware of suffering and pain and injustice. So he wasn't laughing at those things, but
right.
there was a lightness about him and a not taking himself seriously that was just really
Mm,
so striking to me. So it's really an example of the very thing you're
yeah,
talking about that's really fun. I guess in if you go into pop culture, you think of Yoda, right?
yeah,
Hey, Yoda's very wise, but he's also kind of a hoot,
yeah, right. Right.
and anyway, well, we need to wrap this up. And one of the things I want to do, Uli, again, thank you for what you've shared here, and thanks for putting a lot of this in your book, The Wise Leader. And of course, there's much more in the book. I'm sure that many who've been listening to this will want to get the book, and um, they can check out the links in the chat, or we're featuring it on the Pree Center website, or you can just go to Amazon and search for The Wise Leader, and you will find that book very quickly. And so that's how you can get that if you're interested when you're listening. Um, I also want to mention again, those of you who are listening, thank you for being with us live, but this will also be made available through our website and YouTube. And you will also discover, if you dig into this, that we have many more webinars like this one, focusing on a variety of issues, quite a few having to do with the third of life, but many other webinars that we do from the Pree Center. So you can check out the Pree Center website, which it's in the chat, but it's also Depree, DEPREE.org. One last thing, at our website, you also learn more about an online course we're offering this summer alongside mentoring. Is a 4-week course beginning on Wednesday, July 10. And this course is designed for individuals who are interested in becoming a mentor. And I'm thinking that's going to be a lot of folk who are listening to this. And if you're listening to this by YouTube later on, we run this course periodically, so you'll have other opportunities. The course, it draws heavily on scripture and on research that the Pree Center has done on mentoring. And so it's an interactive class, and I've had the privilege of sitting in on it. It's taught by Dr. Merrill Hare, one of my colleagues, who is the creator of Alongside, and Merrill does a wonderful job. So again, Depree, DEPREE.org, and you'll find that course and many other resources. So again, Uli, thank you so much for this conversation. It's been great. And thanks to all of you for being a part of it.
Great. Thanks.